I spent 22 years working for the CIA, and in all that time I learned one simple rule about monsters. The real ones never look like monsters at first. They look ordinary, harmless, sometimes even wounded. And if you're not careful, you start to believe they're just another victim of circumstance. That's how they get close. That's how they get inside your head. I'm telling you this now because by the time I realized what was living beneath my house, it was already too late to pretend I was the one in control. I'd already made the mistake, the kind of mistake that doesn't wash off your hands, no matter how many years pass. The kind that wakes you up at 3 in the morning because you remember a sentence you heard in the dark and suddenly realize what it really meant. You'll probably think I'm lying. Most people do. A few think I'm crazy. Honestly, I'd prefer that. Because if what I'm about to tell you is true, and I swear to God it is, then something else is true too. Something a lot harder to live with. It means we were never alone on this planet. And worse than that, it means we were being watched. The house where it happened sits about 40 minutes outside town, tucked into a long stretch of pine forest, where the road eventually gives up pretending it's pavement. Gravel, dust, trees thick enough to swallow sound. When I bought the place, I thought it would be quiet. After 2 decades of interrogation rooms, safe houses, and concrete facilities with no windows, quiet was the one luxury I wanted. No neighbors close enough to ask questions, no traffic, just wind in the trees and the occasional owl calling from somewhere in the dark. For the first few months, it was exactly what I hoped for. I slept better than I had in years. The nightmares stopped showing up as often. Even the old habits started fading, checking door locks twice, scanning every room automatically when I walked inside, listening for footsteps that weren't there. You'd be surprised how long those instincts stay with you after intelligence work. Once you spend enough time trying to read lies out of people's faces, your brain stops trusting the world to behave normally. Every sound becomes a signal. Every silence feels like a setup. At first, the noises under the house didn't mean anything, just small sounds, a faint scraping now and then. The kind of thing you assume is a raccoon or a stray cat that found its way into the crawl space. The house was old enough for that. Wood foundation, narrow basement corridor, half the pipes exposed like ribs running along the ceiling. Animals got in sometimes. I'd dealt with worse problems in Afghanistan, so I ignored it for a while. The first time it bothered me enough to investigate was early November. Cold had just started creeping into the mornings. That particular night, the wind was hitting the north wall of the house hard enough to make the siding groan. I was sitting in the kitchen with a glass of bourbon, reading through an old notebook I'd kept from my field days. Not official material, just observations, interrogation habits, patterns people fall into when they're hiding something. The kind of notes you write when your job depends on recognizing lies before they're spoken. That's when I heard the sound. 3 knocks, slow, hollow, from underneath the floor. I froze, not out of fear, out of reflex, old training kicking in before my brain even finished processing what I'd heard. Knock, knock, knock. Exactly 3 again. Now here's the thing about working in interrogation. You learn very quickly that patterns mean intention. Animals don't repeat rhythms like that, not clean ones, and definitely not something that sounds deliberate. I sat there for almost a full minute, listening. Nothing. Just the wind pushing through the trees. Finally, I stood up and walked over to the basement door. The house didn't have a full basement, more like a narrow concrete hallway running under the center of the structure. Storage shelves, water heater, furnace. At the far end, a crawlspace hatch that opened into the dirt foundation beneath the rest of the house. I remember my hand hovering over the doorknob longer than necessary. Again, not fear. Instinct. Your body sometimes notices things your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. Something felt wrong. like the quiet on the other side of the door was paying attention. Still, I opened it. The stairs creaked under my weight as I went down. Basements have a smell that never quite goes away. Dust, cold concrete, metal. That night there was something else mixed in. Wet earth, stronger than usual. I reached the bottom step and flipped the light switch. Fluorescent bulbs flickered overhead. The narrow corridor stretched out in front of me. Empty. Shelves on the left, old boxes, tools. The furnace humming quietly at the far wall. Nothing unusual. I almost laughed at myself. A grown man with 22 years of field experience jumping at phantom noises like some rookie agent on his first assignment. Then I heard it again, this time softer, from behind the crawlspace hatch. A slow, dragging sound, like something shifting its weight in the dirt. I walked toward it carefully, not rushing, just observing. Interrogation training again. Never startle a subject before you understand what you're dealing with. The hatch was a simple wooden panel set into the wall near the floor. No lock, just a small metal handle. As I crouched down, the smell hit me again. Wet earth, but stronger now. And underneath it, iron. If you've ever been around blood long enough, you recognize that smell instantly. My hand paused on the handle. That instinct again. Something inside my head quietly whispering that opening that hatch might change things in ways I couldn't undo. For a moment, I actually considered walking away, calling animal control the next morning, letting someone else deal with whatever was down there. But curiosity is a dangerous thing for people in my profession. We're trained to chase the unknown, to pull on threads, even when we suspect a sweater might unravel. So I lifted the hatch. The darkness beneath it swallowed the basement light almost completely. The crawlspace extended several feet under the house, packed dirt and wooden support beams disappearing into shadow. At first, I didn't see anything, just darkness. Then something moved. Not fast, just enough to catch the edge of the light. A shape shifting slightly in the dirt, low to the ground, too large for a raccoon, too still for a dog. My brain started running through possibilities automatically. Coyote, maybe a large one that crawled in through the foundation gap, injured, judging by the smell of blood. That explanation made sense, mostly. I leaned a little closer, trying to see deeper into the shadows, and that's when two eyes reflected the basement light. Yellow, not glowing the way movies like to pretend, just catching the light like an animal's eyes do at night. But they were positioned wrong, too high off the ground, too far apart. I stayed very still. The eyes stayed still, too, watching me, measuring. Another thing interrogation teaches you is patience. Silence can force information out faster than pressure ever will. So I waited. And eventually, something happened that completely shattered the coyote theory. The shape in the darkness shifted, slowly, deliberately, and rose, just a little higher, high enough for me to realize something about the proportions. The shoulders were wrong, too broad. The head shape, God, even now it's hard to describe that moment without feeling that same cold crawl up my spine. Because the silhouette in that crawlspace didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. The muzzle was long, yes, but the skull behind it was shaped wrong for a normal canine. And the forelimbs, they weren't quite legs, not entirely. One of them lifted slightly, not a paw, a hand. Long fingers ending in curved black claws pressing into the dirt. My brain refused to process what my eyes were telling it. So I did what humans always do when reality stops making sense. I tried to force it back into a familiar shape. A sick dog, maybe some deformity, something injured and starving that had crawled under the house looking for warmth. That explanation almost worked. right up until the creature tilted its head and spoke. Not a growl, not a bark, a voice, rough, dry, like it hadn't been used in a very long time, but unmistakably forming words. The first thing it said to me was quiet, almost curious, and I swear to you, even after everything that happened later, that moment still haunts me the most, because the voice from the darkness asked a question that no animal on Earth should have been able to ask. It said, "You finally decided to look." I didn't move. For several seconds, I honestly wasn't sure I had heard the words correctly. When something impossible happens, the human mind has a strange way of stalling. It tries to rewind the moment and replay it in a form that makes sense. But the longer I stared into that crawl space, the harder it became to pretend I'd imagined the voice. The eyes were still there, yellow, focused, watching me the way a person studies a stranger they've already decided they understand better than they should. The smell of wet earth and iron filled the basement, heavy and sour. I realized I was holding the hatch half open, crouched low enough that if the thing lunged forward, it would reach my throat before I could stand. That realization should have sent me scrambling backward. It didn't. Instead, an old reflex took over. The interrogation reflex. When someone says something unexpected, the worst thing you can do is react emotionally. You stay calm. You gather information. You let the subject keep talking. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "What did you say?" For a long moment, the creature didn't answer. The eyes shifted slightly, reflecting the light, as the head tilted in a slow, deliberate motion that reminded me more of a man considering a chess move than any animal behavior I'd ever seen. Dirt shifted under its weight. I could hear the faint rasp of claws dragging through packed soil. When it spoke again, the voice was clearer, still dry, still rough, like something forcing air through a throat that had forgotten how speech worked. "You heard me." I felt a cold knot settle into my stomach. It wasn't the words themselves that disturbed me. It was the calm in the way they were delivered. There was no panic, no aggression, no animal confusion, just quiet observation, like it had been waiting for this moment and had already decided how the conversation would unfold. I forced myself to lean back slightly from the hatch, giving myself room to react if necessary. The creature didn't move closer. It remained just inside the edge of the light, the outline of its shoulders barely visible in the gloom. "You've been under my house," I said slowly. "How long?" Silence again. Then something that sounded suspiciously like a low breath of amusement. "You noticed the sounds weeks ago." The statement landed in the air between us. My heart skipped once. It wasn't a guess. It was said with the certainty of someone who had been watching me long enough to understand my habits. That was when the first real spike of fear cut through my professional composure. Because the only way it could know that was if it had been listening every night. Every step across the floor. Every conversation I'd had on the phone. Every quiet moment when I thought I was alone. "Answer the question," I said, sharper now. Another interrogation instinct. Push for control early. The creature shifted again. This time the light reached just far enough to outline part of its muzzle. Long, narrow, covered in dark fur matted with damp soil. The teeth visible between its lips were not the blunt grinders of an omnivore. They were long and curved, built for tearing. And yet the voice that came out of that mouth carried no threat. "Long enough to know you are not as careful as you think you are." I felt my jaw tighten. It was subtle, but the tone carried something unmistakable. Judgment. Not the kind you hear from an enemy trying to intimidate you. The kind you hear from someone who has been studying you quietly for a long time and finally decided to speak up. I realized my right hand had drifted toward the pocket of my jacket, where I usually kept a small folding knife. The creature's eyes flicked toward the movement instantly. That reaction told me something important. Its vision was sharp, hyper-aware of small changes. The head tilted again. "If you were going to attack," it said, "you would have done it before opening the door." I stopped moving. The words sank in slowly, then a colder realization followed. It wasn't guessing. It understood strategy. That meant reasoning, planning, pattern recognition, all the things we use to define intelligence. "What are you?" I asked quietly. The creature didn't answer right away. Instead, it leaned forward slightly, just enough for the light to reveal more of its upper body. Broad shoulders rolled under thick, dark fur. The forelimbs braced against the dirt floor, and I saw clearly now what I had mistaken earlier. They weren't paws. They were hands. Large, elongated hands with long fingers tipped in curved black claws that pressed into the soil like hooked blades. The wrists rotated in a way no canine anatomy should allow. The creature studied my face for several seconds before speaking again. "You already know the word humans use." My throat felt suddenly dry. There was only one word that fit the shape in front of me, and it sounded ridiculous even forming in my thoughts. Dogman, the kind of thing you read about on obscure forums late at night when you're bored and curious about rural legends. Sightings in forests, tracks too large for wolves, stories told by people who usually sound drunk or terrified, or both. I'd never believed a single one of them, until that moment. I exhaled slowly. "That's not possible." A quiet sound escaped the creature, not quite laughter, more like a tired sigh. "Humans say that often." It shifted again, adjusting its weight against one of the wooden support beams. I noticed something then that made the smell of iron make more sense. One of its legs was bent at a strange angle. The fur around the thigh was dark and clumped together. Blood. The creature was injured, badly enough that it had crawled under the house and stayed there instead of leaving. That realization changed the situation instantly. Injured animals are unpredictable, but injured, intelligent creatures are something else entirely. "You're bleeding," I said before I could stop myself. The yellow eyes held mine. "Yes." The answer was simple, flat, no attempt to hide it. I hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming in my mind since the moment it spoke. "Why are you here?" This time the silence stretched longer, long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the furnace behind me and the wind pressing against the walls above our heads. Finally the creature answered, "Because I ran out of places where your kind would not look." The sentence hung in the air like a stone dropped into deep water. My training told me something important had just been revealed. Not the full truth, but part of it. The way it said your kind carried a weight that suggested history, conflict, maybe even resentment. I leaned slightly closer to the opening again, ignoring the voice in the back of my mind, telling me this entire situation had crossed into territory no training manual had ever prepared me for. "Who's looking for you?" I asked. The creature's gaze didn't waver, but something in its posture changed. A tension along the shoulders, the subtle tightening of the jaw. When it spoke again, the voice had dropped lower. "The same people you used to work for." The words hit me like a physical blow. My mind started racing instantly, pulling together fragments of memories I hadn't touched in years. Black file folders, unofficial briefings, rumors passed quietly between analysts who thought no one important was listening. Reports of biological anomalies in remote regions, sightings that never made it into official channels, projects that were quietly reassigned to departments that technically didn't exist. I had always assumed those files were psychological operations or data misinterpretations, something meant to test analytical responses. But now a wounded creature that looked like a nightmare, standing halfway between wolf and man, was telling me my former employer knew exactly what it was. And worse than that, They were looking for it. I felt the first real wave of dread wash through me. Because if the CIA knew about something like this, and if it had escaped whatever facility or program had been studying it, then there was only one logical outcome. They would come retrieve it, and anyone who had seen it would become a liability. The creature watched my face carefully as that realization settled in. When it spoke again, the voice carried a strange softness, almost pity. "You're beginning to understand." I swallowed slowly. Understand what? The creature's yellow eyes flickered once toward the ceiling above us, toward the quiet house where I had been living peacefully for months, believing I'd left my old life behind. Then it looked back at me and said something that made the cold knot in my chest tighten even further. "That finding me is the worst mistake you have made since leaving them." I wish I could tell you I laughed when it said that I shook my head, closed the hatch, and convinced myself the entire moment was some kind of stress-induced hallucination. That would have been the smart response, the safe response. But intelligence work rewires a person in ways that are hard to undo. Once you spend years chasing hidden truths, the worst thing someone can do to you is imply there's more information just out of reach. Curiosity becomes a reflex, and that reflex can get you killed. I stayed crouched beside the crawlspace hatch, staring into the darkness where the creature waited. The basement light flickered overhead for a second, humming softly. When it steadied again, I noticed something I hadn't registered before. The creature hadn't blinked once since we started talking. Its yellow eyes held mine with an intensity that made it feel like I was the one being examined. "You said they're looking for you," I said slowly. "Who exactly is they?" The creature's muzzle twitched slightly. For a moment I thought it might bare its teeth, but instead it let out a low breath. "You know who." I felt irritation creep into my voice. I asked the question. Silence again. Then the creature shifted deeper into the crawl space, wincing slightly as it adjusted its injured leg. The movement dragged more of its body into the light, and for the first time I saw the full scale of it. Even crouched low, the creature's shoulders nearly brushed the wooden beams supporting the house. Thick fur covered most of its body, dark gray mixed with streaks of black and brown, like forest shadows woven into muscle. The chest was broader than any animal I'd ever seen outside a zoo enclosure, the ribcage expanding slowly with each controlled breath. And the face, God, the face was the part that refused to settle comfortably into any category my brain recognized. The long muzzle was unmistakably canine, lined with rows of sharp white teeth. But the skull behind it carried the proportions of something closer to human anatomy. The brow ridge was heavy. The eyes were forward-facing, not set to the sides like a predator designed purely for hunting. It looked like a creature built for thinking, watching, calculating. "Your agency," it finally said. The words came out flat. "And the ones who work beside it when things must remain unrecorded." My stomach tightened. I knew exactly what it meant by that. During my years inside the CIA, there were always whispers about joint operations with departments that technically didn't exist. Defense research divisions, private contractors with no public names, task forces that handled problems outside the reach of normal oversight. Most of the time, those rumors turned out to be exaggerated, but not always. I studied the creature carefully. "If they were hunting you," I said, "you wouldn't be hiding under my house." The yellow eyes narrowed slightly. "You assume this was my first choice." I felt my jaw set, then start explaining. The creature let out another slow breath, and for the first time since I opened the hatch, its gaze shifted away from me. It looked toward the darkness deeper in the crawl space, where the dirt floor stretched under the house like a tunnel, disappearing into blackness. When it spoke again, the voice carried a faint edge of exhaustion. 3 nights ago, I was running through the forest north of here. I had already been moving for 2 days without rest. Your hunters were close. Too close. Hunters. The word landed heavily. I pictured men in dark gear moving through the trees with thermal scopes and suppressed rifles. I'd been part of operations like that before. The idea that the target might have been something like the creature in front of me twisted my stomach in ways I didn't expect. "What happened to your leg?" I asked. The creature flexed the injured limb slightly. The motion revealed a deep gash along the thigh, where the fur had been torn open. The wound looked ragged, burned around the edges. "They used something new," it said quietly. "A weapon designed to stop creatures larger than your soldiers usually face." I frowned. "What kind of weapon?" For a moment the creature didn't answer. Then it said 2 words that made my blood run colder than anything else that night. "Silver rounds." I blinked. "You're telling me the CIA is using silver bullets now?" The creature's lips pulled back just enough to expose the edges of its teeth. Not a smile. "Something more complicated. You still think your people dismiss old stories as myths?" I felt a strange mix of disbelief and unease crawl through my chest. "Silver is for werewolves," I said automatically. The creature tilted its head. "Humans often use the wrong names for things they barely understand." The basement suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer. I leaned back slightly from the hatch, resting my weight against the concrete floor, while I tried to process the direction this conversation had taken. "Let me get this straight," I said. "You're telling me my former employer has a specialized team hunting creatures like you through the woods, using silver ammunition like something out of a medieval folk tale?" "Yes." No hesitation, no doubt, just that simple answer. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the rough stubble along my jaw. Part of me still wanted to believe this was impossible, but the evidence was sitting 5 feet away in a dirt crawl space under my house. Bleeding, talking, watching me with eyes that held far too much awareness to belong to an animal. "How many of you are there?" I asked quietly. The creature didn't respond immediately. Instead, it studied my face again, the same way an interrogator studies a suspect before deciding how much truth to reveal. Finally, it said, "Enough that your species has been noticing us for centuries." I felt the air leave my lungs slowly. "Dogman sightings," I murmured. The creature's ears twitched slightly at the word. "Your people have many names for us." "What do you call yourselves?" I asked. For the first time since the conversation began, the creature looked uncertain. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was there. "The word would not translate well into your language," it said eventually. That answer told me 2 things at once. First, it did have a language of its own. Second, it was choosing carefully what to share. I recognized that tactic immediately. I'd used it on countless interrogation subjects over the years. Give just enough truth to keep the conversation moving. Hold back the rest until you understand the person asking the questions. I leaned forward again slightly, keeping my voice calm. "Why were they hunting you specifically?" The creature's gaze hardened. "Because I let them see me." The answer caught me off guard. "That doesn't make sense." "It does if you understand your species." I frowned. "Explain." The creature shifted again, dragging its claws slowly through the dirt floor. The sound was soft, but deliberate, like someone thinking through a difficult memory. When it spoke again, the dryness in its voice had deepened. "For most of our history, we stayed far from human settlements. Your kind grows nervous when confronted with things that do not fit your understanding of the world. Nervous creatures become violent." I couldn't argue with that. "But recently," it continued, Some of us believed your species might have changed. I raised an eyebrow. Changed how? The creature's eyes met mine again. We believed you might finally be ready to understand that you're not the only thinking beings walking this planet. I let out a short breath. And how did that experiment work out for you? The creature didn't answer immediately. Instead, it slowly raised its injured leg, revealing more of the wound. The flesh around the gash was dark and swollen. The burn marks along the edges looked ugly. Infected, maybe. The message was clear without words. Point taken, I muttered. The basement fell quiet for a moment. Then the creature said something I didn't expect. You are different from the others. I looked up sharply. What makes you think that? The creature tilted its head again, studying me with unsettling intensity. Because you opened the hatch instead of shooting through the door. I stared at it. You knew I had a gun upstairs? A faint rasp escaped its throat again. That almost laugh sound. You have 3. The knot in my stomach tightened further. The creature watched my reaction carefully before continuing. 1 in the kitchen drawer, 1 in the bedroom safe, 1 in the truck outside. I felt the blood drain slightly from my face, because every single one of those statements was correct. The creature's yellow eyes held mine. You see why your hunters want us captured, it said softly. I swallowed. Why? The creature leaned slightly closer to the edge of the light. Its voice dropped lower, almost a whisper now. Because if humans ever learn what we are truly capable of, your entire understanding of intelligence on this planet will collapse overnight. It paused then, letting the words sink in. And when it spoke again, the next sentence was even worse. And that, it said quietly, is only the beginning of what you do not know. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The basement hummed softly around us, the furnace pushing warm air through old ducts, while the wind outside brushed against the walls of the house. It was an ordinary soundscape, domestic, quiet, the kind of background noise people stop noticing after they live somewhere long enough. But sitting there with the crawlspace hatch open and a wounded creature watching me from the darkness, every little sound felt amplified. The creak of wood above, the faint drip of a pipe somewhere behind the water heater, even the slow rhythm of the creature's breathing as it shifted its weight in the dirt. My brain was doing something strange at that moment. Instead of panicking, it had slipped back into a familiar mode I hadn't used in years. The calm, analytical space interrogation work creates. When the world turns strange, you start cataloging details, behavior patterns, tone changes, micro-expressions. You gather information before making decisions. It's how you stay alive when the person across the table might be lying about where they planted an explosive device. The problem now was that the subject sitting in front of me wasn't human. And yet it was behaving with an intelligence that mirrored every interrogation target I had ever faced. It understood conversation rhythm. It understood when to pause. It understood the power of withholding information. Which meant it understood me. I leaned my shoulder against the concrete wall beside the hatch and folded my arms loosely across my chest. You're telling me my former employer is hunting your kind because you're intelligent. The creature's ears twitched slightly. Not because we are intelligent, it said quietly. Because we are older. That word landed differently than the others had. Older. I frowned slightly. Older how? The creature's eyes reflected the basement light again as it shifted its head. Your species believes it rose to the top of this planet through superior intelligence. You study fossils, tools, bones buried in the ground. I nodded slowly. That's generally how archaeology works. The creature's muzzle lifted just slightly. Not quite amusement, something closer to sadness. Your scientists assume that if another intelligent species existed here before you, it would have left obvious traces. I felt a strange tension tighten across my shoulders. Are you saying it didn't? The creature flexed its claws slowly in the dirt. We learned very early that survival depends on leaving as little trace as possible. I stared at it. A dozen questions pushed forward at once, but one forced its way out first. How long? The creature's answer came without hesitation, long before the first human cities were built. The words echoed in my head for several seconds. Long before the first cities. That meant thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands. My rational mind tried to reject the claim immediately, but another part of me, the part trained to recognize truth when someone had no reason to lie, noticed something important in the creature's tone. It wasn't bragging, it wasn't boasting, it sounded tired, like someone explaining a fact they had repeated many times before. If that's true, I said slowly, why hasn't the world discovered you? The creature tilted its head toward the dark crawl space behind it. Because we never allowed it. I exhaled slowly. You're saying your entire species has stayed hidden from humanity for thousands of years? Yes. I rubbed my forehead with 2 fingers, feeling the dull ache building behind my eyes. That seems statistically difficult. A faint rasp escaped the creature's throat again. Your people see what they expect to see. Wolves, bears, shadows moving in the trees. When something does not fit your understanding, your mind often corrects it before you realize it happened. I couldn't deny that. Human perception fails in strange ways when confronted with the unexpected. Still, something about the creature's calm certainty bothered me. And what happens when someone sees you clearly? I asked. The creature's yellow eyes locked onto mine. Sometimes they tell others. A pause. Most are not believed. I let out a short breath. Dogman sightings. The creature didn't react to the term this time. It simply watched me. I leaned forward slightly. But that doesn't explain the CIA, I said. If you've stayed hidden this long, something must have changed. For the first time since the conversation began, the creature looked genuinely uncomfortable. Its shoulders shifted, muscles tensing beneath the thick fur. When it spoke again, the dryness in its voice had deepened. Your species changed. I waited. It continued. For most of your history, humans were limited. Slow communication, small settlements, weapons that required close distance. Its claws pressed deeper into the dirt. Then your technology began to accelerate. I nodded faintly. Industrial age, satellites, thermal imaging. Yes. The creature's gaze flicked briefly toward the basement ceiling again, as if sensing the world beyond the house above us. Machines that see heat in the darkness, eyes in the sky that can observe entire forests, drones that move silently. I felt the weight of that statement settle into place. Technology had shrunk the planet dramatically in the last 100 years. The places something could hide were getting smaller. So eventually someone spotted you, I said. The creature gave a slow nod. Your hunters were not the first humans to realize we exist. I straightened slightly. Who was? The creature hesitated. That hesitation told me the answer mattered. When it finally spoke, the words came out softer than before. Your governments began discovering us near the end of your last World War. My mind immediately jumped to the 1940s. Intelligence programs exploded during that time. Secret research projects, biological studies, the kind of operations governments bury deep under layers of classification. Let me guess, I said quietly. They didn't try to introduce themselves peacefully. The creature's teeth showed slightly again. Humans rarely approach the unknown with patience. I felt a hollow sensation in my chest. So what happened? The creature looked at me in silence for a long moment before answering. They captured one of us. A chill crawled up my spine. When? 73 years ago. The number was precise. That meant the event had been recorded somewhere, documented, studied. The creature continued. At first they treated it as an animal, a specimen. Its voice dropped lower. They learned quickly that it could speak. I felt my stomach twist. I knew where that story usually went. Interrogation, dissection, experimentation. Humans are very curious creatures when confronted with something new. Did it survive? I asked quietly. The creature didn't answer right away. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, and for the first time since I opened the hatch, I saw something that looked unmistakably like grief pass across its face. When it finally spoke, the words came out barely above a whisper. Not for long. The basement suddenly felt colder. I ran a hand slowly across the back of my neck. And since then? The creature lifted its head again. The yellow eyes had hardened now. Since then, your governments have been searching for the rest of us. I nodded slowly. That explains the hunters. Yes. I studied the creature carefully. But you said earlier you let them see you. The creature held my gaze. I believed humans might have changed enough to understand what we are. I couldn't help it. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. You gambled the safety of your species on that theory. Not the entire species, it said quietly. Only myself. That answer made something tighten in my chest again, because suddenly the situation under my house didn't feel like a random accident anymore. It felt like the aftermath of a failed experiment. You were trying to make contact, I said slowly. The creature gave a small nod. Yes. And instead you got shot with silver ammunition. Another nod. Yes. I stared at the dirt floor between us for a moment. That's a hell of a first impression. The creature didn't respond to the sarcasm. Its gaze had shifted toward the wound on its leg again. The blood had seeped deeper into the fur now, darker against the gray. I realized something then that made my chest tighten further. The creature's breathing had become slightly heavier, slower. The kind of breathing someone uses when they're trying to control pain. How bad is it? I asked. The creature glanced up. Your hunters designed the weapon well. I frowned. That doesn't answer the question. The metal slows healing. I leaned forward slightly. So you do heal faster than normal animals. Usually. The word hung in the air. I understood what it meant immediately. Usually, but not this time. If the bullet's still inside, I said slowly, that would explain it. The creature didn't deny it. I exhaled slowly and pushed myself up to my feet. The movement made the creature tense instantly, claws digging into the dirt again. Relax, I said quietly. If I wanted to hurt you, I would have done it already. The yellow eyes followed me as I walked across the basement toward the shelves, where I kept my tools and first aid supplies. Behind me, the creature's voice came carefully. What are you doing? I grabbed a metal toolbox and set it on the floor beside the hatch. Something incredibly stupid, I said. I flipped the lid open and began sorting through the contents. Alcohol wipes, gauze, surgical tweezers I'd kept from an old field kit. When I looked back toward the crawl space, the creature was watching me, with an expression that almost looked like confusion. You intend to help me, it said slowly. I met its gaze. Yeah. A pause stretched between us. The creature's voice dropped slightly. You realize what that means if your hunters arrive. I nodded once. I do. The yellow eyes studied my face for several seconds, searching for hesitation. When it spoke again, the words carried an emotion I hadn't expected. Why? I considered that question for a moment. Then I shrugged lightly. Because if what you're saying is true, the smartest thing humanity could do right now is start making better first impressions. The creature was silent for a long time after that. Finally, it shifted closer to the edge of the light, exposing more of the wounded leg. Then we should hurry, it said quietly. I looked up. Why? The creature's gaze flicked toward the ceiling one more time. And when it answered, the calm tone had vanished. Because your hunters are already closer than you think. For a moment I thought I had misheard it. The words hung in the basement air like something heavy and cold. Your hunters are already closer than you think. My first instinct was to dismiss it as paranoia. Injured creature, hunted for days, nerves stretched thin. That kind of stress can make anyone imagine danger around every corner. But something about the way it said it didn't feel like panic. It felt like observation. I crouched beside the open toolbox, the metal edges pressing against my knee as I studied the creature again. How close? I asked quietly. The yellow eyes flicked toward the far side of the crawl space, as if listening to something deeper in the earth. For several seconds it didn't answer. Then it looked back at me, close enough that the forest has stopped moving. A faint chill crawled across the back of my neck. I'd spent enough time in remote places to understand what that meant. When predators move through the woods, smaller animals go silent. Birds stop calling. Insects pause their constant background noise. The forest holds its breath. I glanced toward the basement window near the ceiling. From where I stood, I couldn't see outside, only the faint gray glow of night pressing through the glass. How long? I asked. Since before you opened the hatch. That answer made the knot in my stomach tighten. If it was telling the truth, then whoever was out there had already been searching the area before I even realized what was under my house. I forced myself to keep my voice calm. You're sure they're looking for you here? The creature's ears twitched slightly. Your hunters track heat signatures and blood scent. I left both. I glanced down at the wound again. The dark stain spreading through the fur made that statement hard to argue with. I picked up the tweezers from the toolbox and turned them in my fingers. Then we don't have much time. The creature watched the instrument carefully. Removing the metal will help, it said, but it will not be painless. I let out a quiet breath. I've done worse. That wasn't bravado. Fieldwork leaves people with a certain tolerance for unpleasant medical procedures. The creature shifted closer to the edge of the crawl space, dragging its injured leg forward. Now that it was nearer the light, I could see the wound clearly. The gash ran several inches along the outer thigh. The flesh around it was inflamed, the fur stiff with dried blood. At the center of the injury, the skin had closed slightly around a dark metallic edge, barely visible beneath the surface. Silver round, I muttered. The creature nodded faintly. I soaked a cloth in alcohol and held it up. This is going to burn. A faint flicker of something passed across the creature's face. I am familiar with pain. I hesitated only a second before pressing the cloth against the wound. The reaction was immediate. The creature's entire body tensed, claws digging deep into the dirt as a low growl escaped its throat. Not directed at me, just raw instinct, responding to the sudden sting of antiseptic on torn flesh. Easy, I said quietly. If you tear the muscle, we're both in trouble. The growl faded slowly, replaced by the heavy rhythm of controlled breathing. I worked carefully, cleaning away the blood until the dark glint of the bullet became clearer beneath the skin. The metal looked dull gray in the fluorescent light. It was lodged deep. "You're lucky it didn't hit bone," I said. The creature gave a faint huff. "Luck has not been a constant companion lately." I positioned the tweezers over the wound and glanced up at its face. "When I pull this out, it's going to hurt a lot more than the alcohol." The yellow eyes met mine steadily. "Do it." I took a slow breath and slid the tips of the tweezers into the wound. The creature didn't scream. It didn't thrash or snap the way a wounded animal would. But the reaction was still violent in its own controlled way. The muscles along its shoulders bunched hard, and a deep rumble vibrated through its chest as the metal shifted under the pressure. I gripped the bullet and pulled. For a moment it refused to move. Then suddenly it slid free with a wet sound and dropped into the metal tray beside the toolbox. The creature exhaled sharply, head lowering toward the dirt floor as it fought through the pain. Dark blood followed the bullet out, flowing slowly from the wound. I grabbed gauze and pressed it against the injury. "Hold still." The creature obeyed, though its breathing had become heavier now. After a minute, the bleeding slowed. I wrapped the gauze tight around the thigh and secured it with tape. When I finally leaned back, the creature lifted its head again. Its eyes looked slightly clearer than before. "The burning is fading," it said quietly. I nodded toward the tray. The silver bullet lay there dull and harmless now. That was the problem. The creature studied the metal piece for a moment before shifting its gaze back to me. "You have taken a great risk." I shrugged lightly. "Wouldn't be the first time." It watched me in silence, something thoughtful moving behind those yellow eyes. Finally it said, "Humans rarely help something they fear." I wiped my hands on a cloth. "Humans also rarely get the chance to talk to something like you." The creature tilted its head slightly. "Curiosity." "Professional habit," I corrected. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room had shifted slightly now. Not gone, but changed. Then a new sound drifted faintly through the house above us. I froze. It was subtle. A distant mechanical hum rolling through the forest outside. The kind of low vibration you feel more than hear at first. The creature's ears snapped upright instantly. "You hear it," it said. I nodded slowly. "Vehicle." The sound grew louder for a few seconds, then faded again as if the engine had cut off somewhere down the road. My chest tightened. People who hunt in remote areas often shut off engines early and continue on foot to avoid detection. I glanced toward the basement window again. The faint gray light outside hadn't changed, but now the silence beyond the glass felt heavier somehow. "How many?" I asked quietly. The creature's head tilted as it listened. 3, maybe 4. My mind immediately began calculating distances. If they had parked down the road and continued on foot, they could reach the house within minutes. I stood up quickly and closed the toolbox. "Then we need to think fast." The creature shifted its weight carefully, testing the injured leg. It held, though the movement still looked painful. "I cannot run far," it said. I glanced around the basement. There were only 2 exits, the stairs leading up into the house and a narrow window that barely fit a raccoon, let alone a creature its size. The crawl space stretched under most of the house, but if the hunters had thermal equipment, hiding there wouldn't last long. My gaze drifted toward the staircase. A dozen old instincts stirred in the back of my mind. Defensive positions, entry points, escape routes. The creature watched my face as those calculations unfolded. "You are considering whether to surrender me," it said quietly. I looked back at it. If I was going to do that, I wouldn't have removed the bullet. The yellow eyes held mine for a moment longer. Then the creature gave a small nod. Fair point. Another faint sound drifted down from above. This one sharper, the crunch of gravel under boots. I felt the hairs along my arms rise. They were here. I stepped toward the light switch and flicked it off. The basement dropped into darkness except for the faint glow leaking through the small window. The creature melted back into the crawlspace shadows almost instantly, its dark fur blending into the blackness. From above, a distant door slammed somewhere outside. Then voices, muffled, but unmistakably human. I moved quietly to the base of the stairs and listened. The front porch creaked faintly under someone's weight. A beam of light swept past the basement window, cutting across the room for a split second before disappearing again. Flashlights, professional ones, the kind search teams carry. My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Another old reflex from the field. When danger finally arrives, the body often settles into focus. The creature's voice drifted softly from the darkness behind me. Your hunters have arrived. I kept my eyes on the basement stairs. Yeah. Above us, a heavy knock echoed through the house. Once, twice. Then a man's voice called through the front door. Calm, authoritative. Mr. Carter? Federal agents, we need to speak with you. The creature went completely still behind me. I stared up the staircase, my mind racing through the possibilities. Because if the men at that door were who I suspected they were, then the quiet life I thought I'd built in this house had just come to a very abrupt end. And the worst part was, I still hadn't decided which side of that door I was standing on. The knock came again, harder this time. Not impatient exactly, but deliberate. The kind of knock meant to remind the person inside that the men outside were not used to waiting long. I stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, listening to the echo fade through the house above. My heart wasn't racing the way it probably should have been. Instead, it had settled into that slow, controlled rhythm I remembered from operations overseas. When you reach the moment where decisions actually matter, panic wastes time. Thinking keeps you alive. The voice at the door called again. Mr. Carter, we know you're home. That made me pause. I hadn't turned on any outside lights tonight. My truck was in the garage. From the road, the house should have looked empty, which meant one of two things. Either they had surveillance already pointed at the property, or they hadn't come here guessing. They knew exactly where to go. Behind me, the creature shifted quietly in the crawl space. Even in the darkness, I could feel its attention fixed on the staircase. Your hunters are efficient, it murmured. I kept my voice low. Yeah, they are. Another knock echoed through the house. This one was accompanied by the faint creak of someone leaning closer to the door. Then the man's voice again, slightly louder. Mr. Carter, we'd rather not force entry. That was the first real signal. Force entry meant they were authorized to come in whether I liked it or not, probably carrying paperwork that technically allowed them to search the house. Or maybe they didn't even bother with paperwork anymore. Not for this kind of operation. I turned slowly and looked back toward the crawl space. The creature's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light from the basement window. How fast can you move? I whispered. The creature flexed its injured leg carefully. The gauze I'd wrapped around the wound had already darkened with fresh blood, but it held. Faster than before, it said quietly, but not fast enough to outrun trained soldiers. That didn't surprise me. Even without the injury, escaping a coordinated search team at close range would be difficult, especially if they had thermal scanners. I glanced around the basement again. Old shelves, furnace, water heater, a few storage bins stacked along the far wall. Nothing here that could hide a creature 8 feet tall with a heat signature like a bonfire. which meant hiding wasn't the solution. The creature seemed to read that thought on my face. You are considering another option. I met its gaze. Yeah. A moment passed. Letting them take me. I shook my head immediately. No. The creature studied me carefully. It would protect you. I gave a quiet, humorless laugh. You don't understand how this works. Its ears twitched slightly. Explain. I leaned against the wall beside the stairs, lowering my voice even further as another set of footsteps crunched outside on the gravel. If they take you out of this house, I said, they'll also make sure nobody who saw you ever talks about it. The creature's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Meaning I'd probably disappear, too. That answer seemed to settle something in the creature's expression. Not relief, more like confirmation of a suspicion it had already formed. Yes, it said quietly. That aligns with previous observations of your species. Upstairs, the sound of boots shifted across the wooden porch. Someone rattled the door handle once. Locked. Then a second voice spoke outside, lower, harder to hear through the walls. The first man responded quietly, and the porch creaked again as they moved away from the entrance. My stomach tightened slightly. That meant they were repositioning. Standard procedure when a subject doesn't answer the door. Establish perimeter, cover windows, prepare alternate entry points. I pushed away from the wall and moved closer to the crawl space again. Listen carefully, I whispered. The creature leaned forward slightly. Yes? This house sits on a raised foundation, I said. The crawl space runs almost the entire length underneath. The creature nodded faintly. I noticed. At the back corner of the property, there's an old drainage culvert where the ground dips down. The crawl space vents connect to that slope. The creature's eyes sharpened slightly. It understood immediately. A narrow exit. Exactly. The creature considered that for a moment. Too small for me. Normally, yeah. I crouched beside the hatch again. But if you break through the vent frame from the inside, you might be able to widen it enough. The noise would alert them. They're already here, I said. Noise doesn't matter anymore. The creature looked toward the basement stairs, then back at me. You would create a distraction. I nodded once. I can stall them for a few minutes. A long pause followed. The creature studied my face in silence, the way it had several times tonight when deciding whether to trust something I said. Finally it spoke. Why? I shrugged slightly. Because I'm pretty sure your species deserves a chance to leave this planet without being dissected in a lab. The creature's muzzle twitched faintly. That is a surprisingly noble motive for a former intelligence officer. Don't read too much into it, I said. I'm also curious what you're going to do with that chance. Upstairs, something thudded softly against the back of the house. Probably someone checking the windows. Time was running out. The creature shifted its weight again, preparing to move deeper into the crawl space. Then it stopped and looked back at me. If I escape tonight, it said quietly, your hunters will return. I know. They will question you. Yeah. And if they believe you helped me, I met its gaze calmly. Then I guess retirement just got a lot more complicated. For a moment, the creature simply watched me. Then it did something unexpected. It extended one long, clawed hand slowly out of the crawl space, not threatening, just open, waiting. I hesitated only a second before reaching forward and gripping the thick fur along its wrist. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds, but in that brief moment, I felt the raw strength in that limb. Dense muscle under coarse fur. Warm. Very real. The creature withdrew its hand again. Thank you, it said quietly. Then it turned and disappeared into the deeper darkness of the crawl space. I stood up slowly and closed the hatch. Above me, footsteps moved along the side of the house. Someone tapped on the glass of the kitchen window with something metallic, probably the barrel of a rifle. Then the voice from earlier called again, louder now. "Mr. Carter, this is your final request to open the door." I walked up the basement stairs carefully, letting each step creak just enough to sound natural. My mind was already assembling the story I would tell them. Confused homeowner, late-night noise, didn't hear the door at first. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, the knock came one last time, hard enough to rattle the frame. I unlocked the door and pulled it open slowly. 3 men stood on the porch under the cold beam of a tactical flashlight. Black jackets, plain clothes underneath. The man in front held up a badge. Federal credentials, the kind designed to look official without revealing exactly which agency issued them. His eyes studied my face carefully. "Mr. Carter," he said calmly. "Sorry to bother you this late." I leaned against the doorframe, doing my best impression of a tired homeowner pulled out of bed. "What's this about?" The man's expression didn't change. "We're conducting a search in the area," he said. "We have reason to believe something dangerous may have passed through your property tonight." I raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous how?" The man paused briefly before answering. "Large animal." I almost smiled at that. "You guys really knocked on my door at midnight because of a wolf?" The man held my gaze for several seconds. Then he said something that made the smile die before it could form. "Not exactly." Behind him, one of the other agents shifted slightly and turned his flashlight beam toward the dark tree line beside the house. The man in front of me lowered his voice just a little. "Tell me something, Mr. Carter." I kept my face neutral. "Sure." He leaned closer, the light catching the edge of his badge. "Have you seen anything unusual around your house tonight?" For a split second, my mind flashed to the crawlspace beneath my feet, the wounded creature slipping silently through the dirt tunnel toward the back of the property. Then I looked the agent straight in the eye and said the only answer that might buy enough time. "No," I told him. "Just the wind in the trees." The agent watched my face carefully for several seconds. Then he nodded once. But something in his expression told me he didn't believe a single word I had just said. And that meant the next few minutes were about to get a lot more dangerous than anything that had happened in the basement. The agent didn't break eye contact with me. Not for a second. I'd seen that look before, both across interrogation tables and in the mirror afterward. It's the look someone gives when they're not sure you're lying, but they're very sure something isn't right. The porch light above us flickered faintly in the wind. The beam from the agent's flashlight cut across my chest, steady and controlled, never quite rising high enough to blind me. Professional. Everything about these men was professional. "You're sure about that?" he asked calmly. I leaned a shoulder against the doorframe like a tired homeowner who didn't appreciate being questioned at midnight. "Look," I said, letting a little irritation creep into my voice. "If a wolf ran through my yard, I must have missed it." The agent's mouth moved slightly. Not a smile, just the smallest shift of muscle. "Wolf," he repeated. "Interesting word choice." I shrugged. "You said large animal." The 2 men behind him shifted their weight slightly. One of them turned his head toward the dark yard again, sweeping the flashlight beam slowly along the tree line. The forest beyond the house stood quiet and still. Too still. My stomach tightened slightly at that. The creature had been right about the forest holding its breath. The lead agent glanced over his shoulder briefly, then back at me. "Mind if we take a quick look around the property?" he asked. There it was. The request that wasn't really a request. I scratched the back of my neck slowly, buying a few seconds to think. If I refused outright, They'd assume I had something to hide and come in anyway. If I agreed too quickly, they might read that as guilt, too. Timing mattered here. So I sighed and stepped aside just enough to look cooperative without inviting them fully inside. "Knock yourselves out," I said. "Just try not to wake the neighbors." The agent's eyes flicked past me into the house for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Appreciate your cooperation." He stepped off the porch and gestured to the other two men. They moved immediately, splitting around the sides of the house with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed this kind of search dozens of times. The lead agent remained on the porch with me. That alone told me something important. He wasn't here to look for tracks. He was here to look at me. "You live alone, Mr. Carter?" he asked casually. I nodded. "For a while now." He leaned slightly against the railing, glancing out at the dark yard as if making small talk. "Quiet place. That's the idea." A pause stretched between us. The wind shifted through the trees behind the house, carrying the faint smell of damp earth. For a split second, I wondered if the creature had reached the culvert yet. Then the agent spoke again. "Funny thing about quiet places," he said. "You notice sounds more easily." I kept my expression neutral. "Guess that depends on the night." He turned his head and looked at me again. "Did you hear anything unusual earlier this evening?" There it was again, the same question from a slightly different angle. A classic interrogation loop. I'd used it myself countless times. Ask the same thing 3 ways and see if the story shifts. I shrugged lightly. Wind rattled the siding for a while. Heard something bump under the house a couple weeks ago. Probably a raccoon. The agent's eyes sharpened slightly. "Under the house?" I nodded. "Crawl space down there. Animals get in sometimes." That was a calculated move, offering a small truth to reinforce the lie. The agent studied my face carefully. Then he nodded once. "Mind if I take a look at that crawl space?" My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Of course he would ask that. I forced a tired smile. "Sure," I said. "Basement door's in the kitchen." For a moment, neither of us moved. The agent seemed to be weighing something silently. Then his radio crackled faintly on his shoulder. A voice spoke through it in a low whisper. "North side clear." Another voice followed. "Tracks near the tree line. Blood drops." My stomach clenched. The agent lifted the radio calmly. "Direction?" he asked. A pause. Then the reply came back. "Moving away from the house." For the first time since the conversation began, something changed in the agent's expression. Just a flicker, but I saw it. Surprise. That meant they hadn't expected the trail to lead away already. Which meant the creature had reached the vent and gotten out before they arrived at the door. The agent lowered the radio slowly. Then he looked back at me again. "Interesting," he said quietly. I crossed my arms loosely. "Something wrong?" He held my gaze for a moment longer. Then he shook his head slightly. "Probably just a wounded animal passing through." I nodded. "That's what I figured." Another pause settled over the porch. Finally, the agent straightened away from the railing. "Well, Mr. Carter," he said, "looks like we may have arrived a little late." I gave a tired half-smile. Hate when that happens. The agent studied me for one last long moment. Then he nodded to the yard where his men were already returning from the darkness. One of them crouched near the edge of the gravel driveway, shining a flashlight on something in the dirt. Blood, probably. The lead agent stepped off the porch and walked toward them. I remained in the doorway, watching carefully without appearing too interested. The 2 field agents spoke quietly with their leader for a few seconds. One of them gestured toward the woods behind the property. The agent followed the direction of the gesture, staring into the trees for a long moment. Then he turned back toward the house. Our eyes met again across the yard, And that's when I saw it. The small detail that made the cold knot in my chest tighten all over again. He wasn't angry. He wasn't frustrated. He was thinking. Slowly, carefully, like someone adjusting a theory that had just changed shape. He walked back toward the porch at an unhurried pace. I forced myself not to stiffen as he climbed the steps again. "Looks like the trail heads north," he said casually. "Animal probably won't make it far with that kind of blood loss." I nodded once. Nature can be rough. The agent rested one hand lightly on the porch railing. "Still," he continued, "I think we'll stick around the area for a while." "Suit yourself," I said. "Plenty of woods out there." He tilted his head slightly. "You've lived here long?" "Couple years." "Ever seen anything unusual out there in the forest?" The question sounded casual, but the agent's eyes were sharp now, studying every twitch of my face. I shook my head slowly. "Just deer, couple coyotes." The agent nodded thoughtfully. "Coyotes can get big in this region." I almost laughed. Instead, I just shrugged. "Guess so." Another silence stretched between us. Then the agent did something I didn't expect. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal object. A bullet, silver. He held it between two fingers so the porch light caught its dull shine. "You ever seen one of these before, Mr. Carter?" My chest tightened slightly. The bullet I'd removed from the creature was still sitting in the tray in my basement, which meant this one had come from somewhere else. I kept my face blank. "Looks like ammunition." The agent's mouth twitched again. "Specialized ammunition." He slipped it back into his pocket slowly. "Designed for a very specific target." I held his gaze calmly. "Sounds expensive." The agent nodded once. Then he stepped back off the porch again. "Well," he said, "sorry to wake you tonight." I gave a small wave. "No problem." He turned and walked toward the waiting SUV at the edge of the driveway. His men climbed in first. Just before he reached the driver's door, he stopped and looked back at the house one more time. Then he said something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. "Sleep well tonight, Mr. Carter." He paused just long enough for the words to settle. "If you can." Then he got into the vehicle. The engine started quietly. Gravel crunched as the SUV turned around and rolled slowly back down the road into the darkness. I stood in the doorway long after the taillights disappeared between the trees. The night air felt colder now. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Eventually I closed the door and locked it. The house fell silent again. I walked slowly across the kitchen and opened the basement door. The darkness below looked deeper than before. I stepped down the stairs and turned the light back on. The crawlspace hatch was still closed. The metal tray beside the toolbox still held the silver bullet I had removed earlier. But the creature was gone. Completely gone. I crouched beside the hatch and listened to the quiet dirt tunnel beneath the house. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. It had escaped. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something else settling into my chest. Because the last thing the creature had said to me before disappearing into the darkness wasn't about survival. It wasn't even about gratitude. It had leaned close to the edge of the crawl space, yellow eyes steady in the dim light, and whispered something that hadn't made sense until now. "You helped me tonight," it had said softly. "But what you don't understand yet is that I wasn't the one they were really hunting." And standing there alone in the basement, holding a silver bullet between my fingers, I finally began to realize what that sentence might actually mean. I stayed crouched beside the crawlspace for a long time after the SUV disappeared down the road. The basement light hummed faintly above me, throwing a pale glow across the concrete floor and the open toolbox at my feet. Everything looked normal again, ordinary, the kind of quiet scene you'd expect in any rural home after midnight. But the air still carried that faint smell of wet earth and iron, and it was enough to remind me that the last 2 hours had not been normal in any sense of the word. I picked up the silver bullet from the tray and rolled it slowly between my fingers. It felt heavier than it should have, cold, dense. I'd seen specialized ammunition before during my years with the agency, but never anything like this. The metal surface wasn't perfectly smooth. Tiny grooves had been etched along the casing in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, not decorative, functional, like someone had engineered the round for a very particular purpose. I set it back in the tray and leaned my elbows on my knees, staring at the crawlspace hatch. The creature's last words replayed in my mind again. I wasn't the one they were really hunting. At the time it sounded like a strange warning. Now it sounded like something worse, because if the team that showed up tonight hadn't been focused on the creature under my house, then what exactly had they come here looking for? I pushed myself to my feet slowly and closed the toolbox. The metal latch clicked softly in the quiet basement. My brain had started assembling possibilities the way it used to during field operations. Pattern recognition, motive analysis. Something about tonight didn't add up. The agents had arrived quickly. Too quickly for a random search pattern through miles of forest. That meant they had a lead, a signal, something that pointed them directly toward this property. The creature had bled heavily when it crawled under the house, but the agents hadn't seemed surprised when the trail turned away from the building, which meant they already expected the target to move. I rubbed a hand across my face slowly. There was another detail that bothered me even more. The lead agent's behavior. He hadn't acted like a man chasing an escaped biological specimen. He'd acted like someone conducting an interview, probing, testing reactions, watching for inconsistencies. In other words, interrogating. I walked up the basement stairs slowly, my thoughts moving faster now. When I reached the kitchen, the house felt strangely hollow, too quiet. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink, staring out into the darkness beyond the window. The forest looked exactly the same as it had every night for the past 2 years. Tall pines, deep shadows, the gravel road stretching between them like a pale scar. Nothing moved out there. No flashlights, no vehicles. If the agents were still nearby, they were staying well out of sight. That made sense. Surveillance teams rarely vanish completely after a contact like tonight. They observe, wait, see what the subject does next. I took a slow drink of water and set the glass down. Then I walked into the living room and picked up the small remote sitting on the coffee table. A moment later, the television screen flickered to life, displaying the feed from the exterior security camera mounted above the garage. I'd installed the system during my first year in the house out of habit more than necessity. The screen showed the empty driveway and the dark stretch of road beyond. No headlights, no movement. But that didn't mean they were gone. People in my former line of work understood how to watch without being seen. I leaned back against the couch and let the quiet settle around me again. The creature's words kept circling through my mind like a puzzle piece that refused to fit anywhere comfortable. I wasn't the one they were really hunting. What could that possibly mean? A soft creak came from the hallway behind me. My head snapped toward the sound instantly. The house was empty. I knew that. But old instincts react before logic catches up. I stood slowly and moved toward the hallway, listening carefully. The creak came again. Then I realized what it was, the floorboards shifting slightly as the night air cooled the house. Wood expands during the day, contracts at night. I exhaled quietly and returned to the living room. The tension in my shoulders refused to fade. I turned off the television and sat in the dark for a while longer, letting the silence stretch. Eventually, the exhaustion of the night began to settle into my bones. But just as I started considering the idea of sleep, something else occurred to me. Something so obvious, I almost laughed out loud. The agents had searched the yard. They had followed the blood trail away from the house, but they had never actually entered the basement. The lead agent had asked about the crawl space. I'd told him where it was, and then his team had discovered the blood trail leading into the woods, which meant they had decided to follow the trail instead of verifying the space under the house. That wasn't sloppy work. It was deliberate prioritization. The target was escaping. They chose to pursue it, but the silver bullet sitting in my basement told a different story. I stood up again, slowly. My body felt heavy now, but my mind had sharpened again. Because there was one possibility I hadn't considered yet. What if the creature was telling the truth in a very literal way? What if the agents tonight had actually come here looking for something else entirely, and the wounded dogman crawling under my house had simply complicated the situation? I walked back toward the basement door and opened it again. The light below still glowed softly. I descended the stairs and stepped onto the concrete floor once more. Everything looked the same as before. Toolbox closed, tray on the ground, the silver bullet lying exactly where I had left it. But as I crouched beside the crawlspace hatch again, something caught my eye. A small shape resting in the dirt just inside the opening. I frowned and lifted the hatch slowly. The crawlspace beyond was empty, dark and silent. But the shape in the dirt was unmistakable. A single object the creature must have dropped before leaving. I reached inside and picked it up. It was a strip of dark leather tied around a small piece of metal. The metal plate looked old, very old. Its surface was scratched and worn, but faint markings were still visible under the dust. Symbols, not letters from any alphabet I recognized. I turned the object over in my hand, slowly. On the back side of the plate, someone had carved a single line of English text. The letters were rough and uneven, like they'd been scratched into the metal with a knife. I leaned closer to the basement light to read it, and the moment I did, a cold wave rolled down my spine. Because the message wasn't directed at the creature's species. It wasn't about ancient history or hidden civilizations. It was about me. 3 simple words carved into the metal. They know you. I stared at the plate for a long time. My mind was already replaying every moment from earlier tonight. The way the lead agent studied my reactions, the questions he kept repeating, the way he produced that silver bullet from his pocket, like he wanted to see how I would respond. Slowly the pieces began to rearrange themselves into a shape that made far more sense than the version of events I had believed so far. The creature hadn't come under my house by accident. It had come here on purpose. It had allowed itself to be seen, allowed itself to be tracked, because it needed the hunters to follow it to this exact location, to my house. My grip tightened around the metal plate, which meant the real question wasn't why the agency was hunting the creature. The real question was something much worse. Why had the creature chosen me? And as that thought settled into place, another realization followed close behind it. Because if the message carved into that metal plate was accurate, then tonight's encounter on the porch hadn't been a coincidence at all. It had been the opening move of something much bigger. Something that had started long before I bought this quiet little house in the woods. Something that apparently involved me, whether I wanted it to or not. And standing there alone in the basement, holding that strange metal tag in my hand, I finally understood the one truth the creature had tried to warn me about from the beginning. The hunters weren't just searching for monsters in the forest anymore. Now, they were watching the man who had just helped one escape. The realization sat in my chest like a stone. For several minutes I remained crouched beside the crawlspace opening, the metal tag resting in my palm. The basement light hummed above me, steady and indifferent, while my thoughts raced in circles trying to fit the new pieces together. They know you. 3 words. Not they know about you. Not they are looking for you. Just they know you. That phrasing mattered. It suggested familiarity, history. And that was the problem, because as far as I knew, the people who had stood on my porch tonight weren't supposed to know anything about me at all. I slid the tag into my pocket and closed the crawlspace hatch slowly. My old instincts had already switched fully back on. When you realize you might be under surveillance, you assume 2 things immediately. Someone is watching. Someone is listening. Which meant the next hour needed to be very careful. I grabbed the silver bullet from the tray, wiped it with a rag from the toolbox, and slipped it into the same pocket as the metal tag. Then I shut off the basement light and headed upstairs. The house fell into darkness behind me. In the kitchen, I moved quietly, avoiding the light switches. The moon through the window gave me just enough illumination to navigate. Step 1 was simple. Verify whether I was being monitored. I walked through the house slowly, scanning walls, shelves, and corners, the way I used to check hotel rooms overseas. Smoke detectors, light fixtures, power outlets, air vents. Most amateur surveillance devices hide in obvious places. Professionals hide them where you'd never bother checking. 20 minutes later, I had found nothing, which didn't comfort me, because if the agency really had taken an interest in me, the hardware wouldn't be inside the house. It would be outside. Long-range microphones, thermal optics, satellite passes, tools that couldn't be discovered with a flashlight and a screwdriver. I returned to the living room and sat down heavily on the couch. My eyes drifted toward the dark television screen. The security camera feed was still active, though the screen itself was off. I could hear the faint buzz from the electronics. Part of me wanted to turn it on again. The other part of me knew exactly how pointless that would be. If someone was watching this house professionally, they weren't sitting in a car down the road with binoculars. They would be miles away. And that thought brought me back to the lead agent. The man's face replayed clearly in my memory now. Calm, observant, controlled. He hadn't seemed surprised by anything tonight. Not the blood, not the forest, not even the mention of the crawl space. But there had been one moment where his expression shifted. Very slightly. It happened when he showed me the silver bullet. At the time, I thought he was studying my reaction to the ammunition. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe he was looking for recognition. I pulled the bullet from my pocket again and held it up to the faint moonlight. The grooves along the casing caught the light. Engineered, purpose-built, not standard issue. Which meant something else, too. Whoever manufactured these rounds expected to encounter creatures that normal ammunition couldn't stop. That wasn't a hunting tool. It was specialized weaponry. And organizations that produce specialized weapons rarely operate in the open. A soft wind moved through the trees outside. Branches scraped lightly against the side of the house. I stood up again. Sleep was clearly not happening tonight. Instead, I walked down the hallway and entered the small office room at the back of the house. A laptop sat on the desk. I opened it and waited while the screen flickered to life. For a moment, my fingers hovered above the keyboard. Then I typed a name I hadn't searched in over 2 years. Erebus Division. The screen filled with results instantly. Conspiracy forums, archived articles, government contract speculation. Most of it nonsense. But buried in the noise were fragments I recognized from my previous life. Rumors about a classified branch within the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. A black project division rumored to handle biological anomalies. Creatures. Things that didn't fit conventional biology. I leaned closer to the screen. One thread mentioned silver-based ammunition used in containment operations. Another referenced something called Project Nightfall. No official documentation existed, of course, but the descriptions matched what I had seen tonight almost perfectly, which meant the men at my door weren't random government agents. They were hunters, professional ones. I sat back slowly, and that brought my thoughts back to the creature again. Because if those hunters were part of something like Erebus, then the dogman running through the forest tonight wasn't just an animal. It was a target, a classified one, and somehow it had chosen my house as the one place to run. My eyes drifted to the pocket where the metal tag rested. I pulled it out and placed it on the desk. The scratched words stared back at me. "They know you." The longer I looked at it, the less it felt like a warning, and the more it felt like a message meant to reach me specifically, which meant one final possibility was starting to form in my mind. The creature hadn't just used my house as a hiding place. It had come here because it believed I could help it. I rubbed my temples slowly. That idea should have sounded ridiculous, except for one inconvenient fact. 2 years ago, before I moved out here to disappear, I'd spent 8 months working security on a remote research contract for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And during that assignment, I'd seen something inside a containment facility that the official reports described only as Specimen 12. At the time, I assumed it was a classified biological experiment. Now I wasn't so sure, because the creature behind the reinforced glass in that underground lab had looked disturbingly similar to the thing that crawled under my house tonight. My stomach tightened. If that connection was real, then the hunters might already know exactly who I was, and if they knew that, the knock on my front door the next night wouldn't be polite. It would be an arrest, or worse. I closed the laptop slowly. The forest outside rustled again as the wind shifted. And for the first time since moving here, the quiet cabin in the woods didn't feel like a safe place to hide. It felt like the center of a very dangerous game. And somewhere out in those trees, a wounded creature might still be waiting for the one person it believed could help it survive, which meant I had a decision to make before sunrise. Ignore what happened tonight, or step back into a world I had spent 2 years trying to escape. I didn't sleep. By the time the first gray light of morning crept through the trees, I was still sitting at the desk in the back room with the metal tag in front of me. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, less mysterious, but I knew better than to trust that illusion. Night had revealed something that daylight couldn't erase. I was no longer just a man living quietly in the woods. I was part of something again, whether I liked it or not. I stood up slowly and stretched the stiffness out of my back. The laptop screen had gone dark hours ago, but the information I'd read the night before kept circling in my head. Erebus Division, Silver Ammunition, Biological Containment Operations, all unofficial, all deniable, and all pointing toward one very uncomfortable possibility. The creature in the forest wasn't supposed to exist outside a lab. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself another glass of water. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered. 2 years of isolation had put lines in my face that hadn't been there before. But the man staring back at me was still the same one who used to run security clearances and transport protocols for black site facilities. And that man knew something important. If the agency suspected I had contact with the creature, they wouldn't rush back in immediately. They would watch, observe, wait to see if I made contact again, which meant I had a narrow window of time, maybe a few hours, maybe a day, before their patience ran out. I grabbed my boots from the back door and stepped outside. Cold morning air filled my lungs. The gravel driveway was empty, but I didn't let that fool me. Surveillance teams could sit miles away and still monitor the area with long-range optics. So I moved normally, casually, like someone starting an ordinary day. I walked toward the edge of the yard where the forest began. The ground still held the dark stains of dried blood from the night before. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed them, but I had spent enough years tracking human targets in worse terrain to recognize exactly where the trail continued. It led into the trees, and after a few seconds of staring at it, I stepped off the grass and followed. The forest swallowed sound quickly. Within 50 yards, the house was barely visible behind me. The blood trail wasn't hard to follow at first. Drops marked the fallen leaves in uneven intervals, heading northeast between the tall pines. The creature had been moving fast, but not cleanly. It was hurt, badly. About 20 minutes into the woods, the trail changed. The droplets became smears along tree trunks, where the creature must have steadied itself. Claw marks scored the bark in deep, ragged lines. I paused beside one of the trees and ran my fingers along the gouges. Whatever made those marks had strength far beyond anything natural. And yet, the spacing of the prints on the forest floor told a strange story. The creature hadn't been running blindly. It had been navigating, choosing a direction, heading somewhere specific. I continued following the trail deeper into the forest. The terrain sloped downward into a narrow ravine filled with thick brush. A small creek wound through the center, its water running dark beneath the morning shade. That's where the trail disappeared. I crouched near the edge of the water and studied the ground carefully. The creature had entered the creek intentionally. Smart move. Running water breaks scent trails and washes away blood. But there was one problem with that strategy. You still have to exit somewhere. I scanned the banks on both sides, and that's when I saw it. Across the creek, about 30 yards upstream, the brush had been crushed flat. Something big had climbed out. I crossed the creek slowly, stepping on rocks to avoid disturbing the mud. The forest felt heavier here, quieter. The kind of silence that makes the back of your neck tighten. I moved through the flattened brush and into a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. And that's when I stopped walking, because the creature was there. It sat against the base of a fallen tree at the far edge of the clearing. Massive, easily 7 feet tall, even while slumped. Its dark fur was matted with dried blood, and one shoulder hung at an unnatural angle. The silver bullet wound had torn a deep groove across its rib cage. But the creature wasn't unconscious. Its eyes were open, watching me, golden, alert. For several long seconds, neither of us moved. Then the creature slowly raised one clawed hand, not in aggression, but in what looked almost like a gesture of recognition. Its voice, when it spoke, was rough and strained, but unmistakably clear. "You came." I felt the weight of the pistol at my hip, though I didn't reach for it. Instead, I took a careful step closer. "You left me a message," I said quietly. The creature's lips pulled back slightly, revealing long, wolf-like teeth. Not a threat, more like fatigue. "Yes," it said. Its gaze shifted briefly toward the distant forest behind me. "They follow soon." A cold ripple moved down my spine. "How soon?" I asked. The creature's ears twitched slightly, as if listening to something far away. Then it looked back at me. "Hours, maybe less." I exhaled slowly. So much for having time. I studied the creature more closely now. Up close, the wound looked worse than I thought. Deep. Silver contamination around the edges. If the rumors about those rounds were true, the metal itself would be poisoning the creature's system. It wouldn't survive long without help. Which brought us to the real problem. I crossed my arms and looked at it carefully. "You dragged the hunters to my house," I said. The creature didn't deny it. "Yes." "Why?" For a moment the creature said nothing. Then it reached slowly toward the leather cord hanging around its neck. From beneath the fur, it pulled out something small. Metal. Another plate, almost identical to the one sitting in my pocket. Except this one had a different message carved into it. The creature held it up so I could read. 4 rough words scratched across the surface. "You freed my brother." I stared at the plate, then back at the creature, and suddenly a memory I had buried for 2 years rose sharply to the surface. The underground containment facility, the reinforced glass chamber, specimen 12, and the night the alarm system failed, allowing one of the captured creatures to escape into the forest before security teams could stop it. My stomach dropped, because until this moment I had always believed the escape had been a coincidence. But the creature in front of me was looking at me like it knew something I didn't. And slowly, it spoke again. "You thought the doors failed," it said, its golden eyes locked onto mine. "But I saw the cameras." The wind moved softly through the trees, and the creature's voice dropped to a quiet growl. "You opened them." For a moment, the forest felt like it had stopped breathing. I stared at the creature, trying to process what it had just said. The clearing was silent, except for the faint trickle of the creek behind me, and the distant rustle of wind moving through the pines. "You're wrong," I said automatically. The words came out flat, almost defensive. The creature didn't react. Its golden eyes stayed fixed on me with a calm that made the denial feel hollow, even as I said it. Slowly it lowered the metal tag back against its chest. "You remember alarms," it said quietly. "You remember confusion, lights, men running." A cold feeling began spreading through my stomach, because I did remember that night. The alarm system had gone crazy, doors opening and closing across the facility, emergency lights flashing, security teams scrambling between containment levels. Officially, the report said a software malfunction caused a temporary breach in the holding sector. Unofficially, the entire event had always bothered me. Too many systems failed at the same time, too perfectly. I swallowed and shook my head. "I didn't open any doors," I said. The creature studied my face carefully. Then it spoke in a low, steady tone. "You accessed the control console." The memory hit like a sudden flash of lightning. A dim security room, rows of surveillance monitors, a terminal glowing in the dark. I had gone there that night to check a motion alert inside the containment corridor. Standard procedure. I remembered typing commands into the system to isolate the alarm signal. But the rest of that moment had always been fuzzy, like trying to recall the details of a dream after waking up. The creature continued. "You looked at my brother," it said. Another image surfaced in my mind. Behind reinforced glass, a massive shape pacing slowly inside a holding chamber. Golden eyes watching the security cameras, watching me. My heart began to pound harder. "I didn't release it," I insisted. The creature tilted its head slightly. "Not intentionally." That word hung in the air between us. My thoughts began racing now. The system console, the command prompts. I had overridden several lockdown protocols to isolate the alarm. But what if the system had been tampered with before I got there? What if someone had altered the command routing so my inputs triggered something else entirely? A delayed door release, a containment unlock, a perfect scapegoat. The creature must have seen the realization forming in my face, because it nodded slowly. "They used you." The wind shifted through the clearing. My pulse hammered in my ears as the pieces started rearranging themselves. If the agency, or whoever ran that program, needed to stage an escape scenario, they would need someone to blame, someone with access clearance, someone who could be quietly pushed out of the program afterward. Like a security contractor who suddenly decided to move into the woods and disappear from government work. My hands curled into fists. "So you're saying they framed me?" I said. The creature didn't answer right away. Instead, it leaned its head back against the fallen tree, breathing slowly through obvious pain. Then it spoke again. "They hunted him for 2 years." My eyes narrowed. "Your brother?" The creature nodded. "Until last winter." A heavy silence followed. "What happened to him?" I asked. The creature's gaze drifted toward the forest canopy above. Its voice dropped lower. "They killed him." The words landed like a stone. "And now they hunt me," it continued. I exhaled slowly. "So you led them to me?" "Yes." "That's a hell of a gamble." The creature looked back at me. "You are the only human who opened a cage." Something about the way it said that sent a chill through me. Not accusing, not angry, almost respectful. Before I could respond, the creature suddenly stiffened. Its ears twitched. The fur along its neck lifted slightly. "What?" I asked. The creature's head turned toward the western ridge above the ravine. "They come." My stomach tightened. "You hear them?" The creature nodded once. "Engines." I listened carefully. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, far away through the trees, a low mechanical hum. Vehicles, more than one. The hunters had picked up the trail again, and they were moving fast. The creature shifted slightly, trying to stand. It managed to push itself halfway up before collapsing back against the log with a low growl of pain. The wound in its side had started bleeding again. I stepped closer and knelt beside it. "That bullet is poisoning you," I said. "Yes. If you keep moving, you'll bleed out before they even reach us." The creature met my eyes. "Then leave." I didn't move. "They hunt you too," it said quietly. I looked down at the wound again. The silver contamination had darkened the surrounding flesh. Removing the bullet fragment might slow the poisoning, but doing that here, in the open, with hunters closing in, was a risk, a big one. But if the creature died here, the hunters would arrive minutes later and find me standing beside the body, which would answer every question they had about where my loyalties were. I sighed and pulled the small field knife from my belt. The creature watched the blade carefully. "You trust me?" I asked. It nodded once. "You opened a cage." I shook my head. I might regret that reputation. Then I pointed the knife toward the wound. "This is going to hurt." The creature gave a low, rumbling sound that might have been a laugh. "It already does." I took a steady breath and began cutting carefully along the torn flesh where the bullet had passed through. The creature clenched its claws into the dirt, but didn't cry out. Blood soaked into the leaves as I worked. After a few tense seconds, the metal fragment came into view. A jagged shard of silver lodged deep between muscle and bone. I gripped it with the tip of the knife. "Almost there," I muttered. Then I pulled. The creature jerked violently as the shard came free. For a second I thought it might lose consciousness, but it stayed upright, breathing hard. I tossed the silver fragment into the creek behind us, where it vanished beneath the dark water. The creature's breathing slowly steadied. "Better?" I asked. "Yes." Then its ears twitched again, and this time I heard it too. Closer now. Engines. Multiple vehicles moving along the forest road above the ravine, maybe half a mile away. The hunters were almost here. The creature pushed itself slowly to its feet, still weak, but standing. I wiped the blood from my knife and looked up at it. "So," I said, "you dragged me into this mess." The creature tilted its head. "You were already inside." "Fair point." I slid the knife back into its sheath and glanced toward the ridge where the engine noise was growing louder. Then I looked back at the creature. "One question before we run," I said. It waited. I took a breath. "You said they used me 2 years ago." "Yes." "Why?" The creature's golden eyes seemed to darken slightly. Its answer came in a low, steady voice. "Because they were never trying to contain us." A distant helicopter rotor suddenly thumped faintly through the air above the trees. The creature looked up toward the sky, then back at me. "They are trying to make more." And somewhere above the forest canopy, the hunt had just arrived. The helicopter reached the clearing before either of us moved. The first distant thump of the rotor grew rapidly louder, chopping through the forest canopy until loose pine needles began falling through the air. I looked up through the branches and saw the dark shape sliding between the clouds, low enough that the wind from its blades bent the tops of the trees. The creature beside me stiffened, nostrils flaring. "Scout first," it growled quietly. "Ground hunters behind." I nodded once. That matched the pattern perfectly. Air unit locates the target. Ground teams move in to surround. No escape routes left open. I glanced toward the ridge above the ravine, where the engine noise was now unmistakable. At least 3 vehicles, maybe 4, pushing along the narrow Forest Service road. They were moving faster than I expected. "We need to move," I said. The creature shook its head slightly. "Open ground." It gestured with one claw toward the clearing around us. "They see heat." I swore under my breath. Of course they would. Thermal imaging from the helicopter would light us up like 2 bonfires. The creature suddenly grabbed my shoulder with surprising speed. "Creek," it said. I followed its gaze toward the narrow stream winding through the ravine. Running water, cold, dense brush overhead. Thermal distortion and partial cover. Not perfect, but better than standing in the open. Another thunderous chop from the rotor echoed above us as the helicopter drifted sideways through the canopy, searching for an angle. "Move," I said. The creature didn't argue this time. It limped after me as we slid down the ravine slope toward the creek. The water was shockingly cold when it soaked through my boots, but I kept moving upstream, forcing myself to stay in the deepest sections where the water reached my calves. The creature moved more easily now that the bullet fragment was gone, though every step still left faint clouds of diluted blood drifting through the current. Behind us the helicopter circled once more. A beam of white searchlight suddenly pierced through the trees, sweeping across the clearing we had just left. I ducked lower into the brush along the creek bank. The creature crouched beside me, blending almost perfectly with the shadows under the branches. The searchlight paused on the fallen tree where it had been resting minutes earlier. I could almost imagine the pilot's voice over a radio. Fresh disturbance, blood, possible contact. A moment later the light shifted again and began sweeping outward through the surrounding forest. "They know we were here," I whispered. The creature nodded slowly. But not where now. The helicopter drifted farther down the ravine, its rotor noise echoing between the slopes as it scanned the terrain ahead. I waited until the sound moved a few hundred yards away before standing again. "Upstream," I said quietly. "Water will hide the trail." The creature followed without question. For nearly 15 minutes we pushed slowly through the creek, staying under dense branches whenever possible. My legs were numb from the cold, but the sound of the helicopter circling somewhere behind us kept me moving. Eventually the ravine curved sharply east, narrowing into a steep gorge where massive boulders forced the creek into deeper pools. I stopped behind one of the rocks and listened. The vehicles on the ridge had stopped. Doors slammed faintly in the distance. Voices carried through the trees. The ground teams had arrived. The creature crouched beside the rock, ears twitching constantly as it listened to sounds I couldn't hear yet. Then it spoke quietly. 8. I blinked. 8 what? Hunters. My stomach tightened. 8 armed operators with specialized ammunition and air support. Not exactly the kind of group you want chasing you through a forest. I peeked carefully around the rock. The ravine continued another 100 yards before splitting into 2 narrow channels between towering stone walls. A fork in the terrain. I turned back to the creature. Can you climb? Its golden eyes flicked upward toward the cliffside. Yes. Good. I pointed toward the left channel where a steep rock face rose 20 feet above the creek. Thick roots from nearby trees hung down the wall like ropes. We go up there. The creature studied the route for a second and then nodded. We moved quickly now, splashing through the shallow water until we reached the rock wall. I grabbed the first thick root and hauled myself upward, boots scraping against the stone as I climbed. The creature followed behind me with far more agility despite its injuries. Within seconds, we pulled ourselves onto a narrow ledge halfway up the ravine wall. Dense ferns and low branches covered the ledge completely, hiding us from below. I flattened myself against the rock and looked down. 5 minutes later, the first hunters appeared at the bottom of the ravine. Black tactical gear, compact rifles fitted with suppressors and long optics. Their helmets carried mounted thermal goggles and small camera rigs. Professionals. They spread out across the creek bed immediately, scanning the terrain with practiced precision. One of them knelt near the water and pointed downstream. Blood diluted, he said. His voice carried clearly in the still air. Target entered creek here. Another operator looked up toward the helicopter circling above the trees. Air unit lost heat signature 2 minutes ago, he said into a headset. Targets likely moving through water channel. The team leader stepped into the creek and studied the forks in the ravine ahead. I held my breath. From our position above them, we could see everything, but if even one of them glanced up. The leader finally pointed toward the right fork. Tracks exit there, he said. They're heading east. The entire team moved immediately in that direction, boots splashing through the creek as they disappeared between the rock walls. I waited until the last man vanished before exhaling slowly. The creature beside me gave a quiet rumble. They chose wrong path. I nodded, for now, because something about the team leader's confidence bothered me. He had barely examined the terrain before deciding which direction we went, almost like he already had another way of tracking us. The creature must have sensed my concern. What? It asked quietly. I stared down the ravine where the hunters had gone. Then I remembered the silver bullet fragment I had thrown into the creek earlier. A sudden realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Damn it. The creature turned toward me. What? I looked at it grimly. Those rounds aren't just silver, I said. They're tagged. The creature's ears lowered slightly. Tagged? Microtransmitters, I said quietly. So the helicopter doesn't need thermal. Understanding flashed in its golden eyes. They track the bullet. I nodded. Which means... I pointed down toward the water where the fragment had disappeared earlier. They know exactly where we are. As if on cue, the helicopter above the forest suddenly shifted direction. The roar of its rotor blades grew louder again as it banked hard and began moving back toward the ravine. The creature slowly rose to its feet beside me. Then we run again. I looked at the cliff above the ledge. Another 30 feet of rock climbed toward the forest floor above the ravine. Beyond that, miles of wilderness. No roads, no easy landing zones, but maybe enough terrain to disappear if we moved fast. The helicopter's searchlight suddenly burst through the trees again, sweeping toward our position. I grabbed another root and started climbing. "Up," I said. The creature followed immediately behind me, and somewhere above the tree line, the hunters had just reacquired their target. The searchlight cut through the branches seconds after we started climbing. A white beam sliced across the ravine wall below us, illuminating the rock ledge we had just abandoned. I pressed myself against the stone and kept moving upward, gripping roots and cracks while the helicopter circled overhead. The creature climbed behind me with unsettling speed, despite its injuries, claws finding holds I couldn't even see. Loose stones broke free under our weight and tumbled into the creek below. The helicopter pilot must have heard them, because the beam jerked upward suddenly, sweeping across the cliff face. I froze against the rock as the light passed only a few feet beneath my boots. The creature flattened itself against the stone behind me, barely visible in the shadows. The beam lingered for a moment, then drifted away again as the helicopter repositioned above the ravine. I climbed the last 10 feet quickly and pulled myself over the edge onto the forest floor. The creature vaulted up beside me a second later. "Move," it growled. We didn't wait. The forest above the ravine was thicker and darker, the ground uneven with fallen logs and tangled roots. We pushed north through the trees at a fast pace, weaving between trunks and ducking under low branches. Behind us, the helicopter noise grew louder as it followed the ravine, searching for the exact point where we had climbed out. "How far to road?" the creature asked. "Not going to one," I said. "Roads are where they want us." We angled deeper into the forest instead, heading toward higher terrain where the trees grew denser and the ground turned rocky. The creature kept pace easily now, its breathing steadier since the bullet fragment had been removed. But the wound still bled slowly down its side, leaving dark streaks across its fur. "You should have left," it said suddenly while running. "Too late now," I replied. We crested a low ridge and dropped down the other side into a narrow valley filled with old-growth pines. The trees here were massive, their branches interlocking high above the ground and blocking much of the sky. Good cover from the helicopter, but not perfect. The roar of the rotor suddenly grew louder again behind us. I glanced back and saw the beam of the searchlight cutting through the treetops about 100 yards away. "They found the climb point," I said. The creature's ears flicked back. "How many machines?" "One helicopter," I said. 8 hunters on foot. "More will come." "Probably." We pushed deeper into the valley until the ground flattened out near a stretch of large moss-covered boulders. I slowed slightly, scanning the terrain ahead. The forest here was broken by scattered rock formations that created natural blind spots. It was the first place since the ravine where we could possibly hide without leaving a clear trail. The creature stopped beside one of the boulders and listened to the air carefully. "They spread out," it said quietly. I could hear it now, too. Faint shouts in the distance. The hunters were moving through the forest line by line, flushing us out. "We can't outrun them forever," I said. The creature looked at me with those steady golden eyes. "Then we change hunt." I frowned. "Meaning?" It stepped closer and pointed one claw toward the helicopter noise drifting through the trees. "Cut the eye." I followed its gaze upward. The helicopter was the only reason the hunters had reacquired us so quickly. Without it, they would be blind in the dense forest. "You planning to throw a rock at it?" I asked. The creature bared its teeth slightly. "No." Then it pointed to the ridge rising behind the valley. "Machines must see to fly low." I understood immediately. Higher ground. If we could reach the ridge before the helicopter repositioned again, the pilot would have to rise above the tree line to maintain visual contact. Expose itself. I looked at the creature again. "You're thinking ambush?" "Yes." The plan was insane, but also the only move that didn't involve running until we collapsed. I nodded once. Then we climb. We moved quickly toward the ridge slope, weaving through the trees while the helicopter noise drifted closer again. Halfway up the hill, the ground turned steeper and covered with loose stones. I slowed slightly to keep from sliding backward. The creature climbed ahead of me now, putting itself upward with powerful motions, despite the injury. As we reached the top, the forest opened into a rocky outcrop, overlooking the valley below. From here I could see the helicopter clearly for the first time since the ravine. A matte black aircraft hovering just above the treetops, nose angled downward as its searchlight swept across the forest floor. "How do we bring it down?" I asked quietly. The creature crouched beside a cluster of jagged rocks and studied the aircraft. "Not destroy," it said, "blind." Then it looked at a fallen pine trunk lying near the edge of the ridge. The tree had been split by lightning years ago, and now rested half-rotted across the rocks. The creature placed both hands against the trunk and pushed. Slowly the massive log began to shift. I stepped forward to help, bracing my shoulder against the wood. Together we rolled the trunk toward the ridge edge. "You realize helicopters don't usually crash because of trees rolling down hills," I muttered. The creature ignored me. When the trunk reached the edge, it stopped and waited. The helicopter drifted lower into the valley again, the pilot clearly trying to get a better view beneath the canopy. The creature's ears twitched as it tracked the sound. Then it growled quietly. "Now." We shoved the trunk over the ridge. The log tumbled down the steep slope, smashing through branches and bouncing between rocks as it accelerated. The crashing noise echoed through the valley. The helicopter pilot reacted instantly, swinging the searchlight toward the falling debris. For a moment the aircraft dipped lower, trying to identify the disturbance. That was exactly what the creature had been waiting for. It grabbed a massive loose stone from the ridge, something easily 200 pounds, and with a roar of effort, hurled it down the slope toward the hovering aircraft. I had barely registered what it was doing before the rock vanished into the trees below. A second later, there was a sharp metallic crack, followed by a burst of sparks beneath the helicopter's nose. The aircraft jerked violently sideways. The searchlight flickered out instantly. The rotor pitch changed as the pilot fought to stabilize the damaged craft. "You hit it," I said in disbelief. The creature watched silently as the helicopter rose higher above the tree line, pulling away from the valley. A thin trail of smoke drifted behind it as it retreated toward the distant road. The creature finally turned back to me. I closed. I nodded slowly, but the victory lasted about 3 seconds, because somewhere below us in the forest, one of the hunter's radios crackled loudly through the trees, and a voice shouted up toward the ridge, "Targets located!" Gunfire exploded through the forest a moment later, as the ground team opened fire toward our position. Bark shattered off the rocks beside us as suppressed rifle rounds punched into the ridge. I dropped behind a boulder and looked at the creature. "Well," I said, "now we're the ones being hunted." The creature crouched low beside the rock, eyes glowing in the fading daylight. "Good," it growled quietly. "Let them come." The first volley of rifle fire tore splinters out of the rocks around us. Suppressors kept the shots from echoing like normal gunfire, but the impacts were unmistakable, sharp cracks as rounds smashed into stone and wood. I dropped flat behind the boulder and pulled the pistol from my belt, though I knew it was almost useless against trained operators with rifles. The creature crouched beside me, completely still except for the slow rise and fall of its chest. Its golden eyes were fixed on the tree line below the ridge. "They climb," it said quietly. I risked a glance over the rock. Dark shapes were already moving through the forest 30 yards down the slope, spreading out as they advanced. They weren't rushing blindly. They were sweeping the ridge carefully, one covering while another moved. Professionals who had done this many times before. 4 on this side, I whispered. Others probably circling. The creature nodded slightly. They hunt like wolves. Yeah, I said, only with better weapons. Another shot snapped through the air and struck the boulder inches from my head. Stone fragments peppered my face. I ducked again and swore. They've got optics on us, I muttered. The creature shifted slightly and looked toward the opposite side of the ridge. Not all. I followed its gaze. The rocky outcrop sloped sharply downward behind us, into another stretch of forest. Steeper terrain, thick brush, hard to climb, hard to shoot through, a possible escape route. We run? I asked. The creature shook its head slowly. If we run now, they follow. I frowned. So what's the plan? The creature's lips pulled back slightly, revealing its long teeth. You make noise. I stared at it. You want me to what? But before I could argue, it moved. In one fluid motion, the creature leapt from behind the boulder and sprinted across the ridge toward a cluster of trees on the left side. The hunters reacted instantly. 3 rifles snapped toward the movement and opened fire. Bark exploded from the trees as rounds chased the creature through the branches. It vanished behind a fallen trunk just as quickly as it had appeared. I suddenly understood. Distraction. I took a breath, stood up behind the rock, and fired 2 quick shots from the pistol toward the tree line below. The shots cracked loudly compared to the suppressed rifles. Immediately, several rounds snapped back toward my position, forcing me to dive behind the boulder again. "Hey!" I shouted down the slope. "You guys lost something?" More gunfire answered me. The creature moved again, this time appearing briefly among the rocks farther left. The hunters shifted their aim toward it. Exactly what we needed. Now, the creature growled from somewhere in the trees. I bolted from behind the boulder and sprinted down the backside of the ridge. The slope was steeper than it looked. Loose dirt and stones slid under my boots as I half ran, half fell between the trees. Behind me I heard more gunfire and the deep snarling roar of the creature as it crashed through the forest in the opposite direction. The hunters shouted to each other. Their formation was breaking as they tried to track both of us at once. That was the point. I kept moving downhill until the ridge blocked the gunfire behind me. Then I slowed and crouched behind a thick pine, breathing hard. The forest here was darker and quieter. For a few seconds I heard nothing but wind in the branches. Then a heavy shape landed silently beside me. I nearly jumped before realizing it was the creature. "You move loud," it said. "I was being shot at," I replied. It tilted its head slightly. "Still loud." I ignored that and glanced uphill. "Did they follow?" The creature listened for a moment. 2. My stomach tightened. "Only 2? Others chase false trail." Good. The split had worked. But 2 trained hunters were still more than enough to cause serious problems. I looked around the terrain quickly. The forest floor here was broken by thick roots and patches of moss-covered stone. Narrow spaces between the trees created natural choke points. "We can't keep running forever," I said quietly. The creature's eyes gleamed. "Then we stop running." I looked at it carefully. "You want to fight them?" "Yes." Normally I would have called that a terrible idea, but right now it was the only way to break the pursuit before the rest of the team regrouped. I pointed toward a narrow gap between 2 large boulders about 15 yards away. "There," I said. "They'll have to pass through that." The creature nodded once and disappeared into the shadows beside the rocks. I crouched behind a fallen log across the clearing and waited, pistol ready, though I doubted it would matter much. The forest went completely still. After about 30 seconds, I heard them, slow footsteps moving carefully downhill, branches shifting as someone pushed through the brush. 2 hunters emerged between the trees above us, black armor, rifles raised. One knelt to examine the ground while the other covered the forest ahead. "Tracks continue downhill," the kneeling one said quietly. The second hunter stepped forward toward the gap between the boulders, exactly where we wanted him. As he passed between the rocks, the creature exploded out of the shadows. The attack was so fast, it barely looked real. One massive arm slammed into the hunter's chest, knocking him backward before he could even fire. The rifle flew from his hands as he crashed into the ground. The second hunter spun toward the noise, bringing his weapon up, but I fired first. My shot struck his shoulder, jerking him sideways just as the creature lunged again. It closed the distance in a single bound and slammed the hunter against a tree hard enough to crack the bark. The rifle clattered to the forest floor. Silence fell again, almost instantly. I stood slowly, heart hammering. The creature released the second hunter and stepped back. Both men were unconscious, though still breathing. I stared at the scene for a moment. "You didn't kill them," I said. The creature shook its head. "No need." It picked up one of the fallen rifles and examined it briefly before tossing it aside. Then it looked back toward the ridge above us. "Others come soon." I nodded grimly. Yeah. The fight had bought us a few minutes at best, but as I looked down at the hunters lying on the ground, something else caught my attention. One of them had a small metal device clipped to his vest, a locator tablet. Its screen was still active. A blinking red marker pulsed in the center of the map. Our location. I showed it to the creature. "This is how they're coordinating," I said. The creature studied the device briefly. Then it looked at me. "Can you change it?" I thought for a second. Then a slow smile spread across my face. "Yeah," I said. "I think I can." I zoomed the map outward and tapped a new point several miles west of our position, deep in a section of forest filled with ravines and thick rock formations. Perfect terrain for a long search. Then I dragged the blinking marker onto that spot and confirmed the override. The locator beeped softly as the signal updated. Somewhere out there, the rest of the hunters would now believe their targets had suddenly moved 3 miles away. I shut the tablet off and tossed it into the creek beside us. The creature watched the device vanish beneath the water. "Now?" it asked. I looked north into the darker forest, where the mountains began rising beyond the valley. "Now," I said, "we disappear." We moved north for nearly an hour without speaking. The forest changed gradually as the terrain rose into the foothills. Pine gave way to thicker spruce and old hardwoods, their trunks wider and their branches forming a dense ceiling above us. The deeper we went, the darker it became, even though the sun was still up somewhere behind the clouds. Neither of us heard helicopters anymore. That didn't mean the hunters had given up. It only meant they were searching somewhere else for now. Exactly where I had told their locator tablet we were. The creature moved beside me silently now, conserving its strength. The wound in its side had slowed to a faint trickle of blood, but it still wasn't in good shape. Eventually we reached a rocky overlook, where the forest opened slightly along a cliff edge. Below us stretched miles of untouched wilderness. No roads, no clearings, just mountains and trees fading into the distance. I stopped there and looked out across the valley. "This is where we split," I said. The creature turned its head slowly. "Split?" "You go deeper into the mountains," I said. "Places even their helicopters can't land." The creature watched me for a long moment. "And you?" I shrugged slightly. Someone's going to notice those 2 hunters we left behind eventually. When they do, they'll start asking questions again. The creature's eyes narrowed slightly. You will run. No, I said. I won't. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the metal tag it had left in the crawl space. The scratched message, "They know you," caught the faint light. Running is what got me into this mess 2 years ago, I said quietly. I'm done running. The creature studied my face carefully. Then what? I looked back out across the valley again. Your brother escaped that facility because someone sabotaged their system, I said. Maybe it was me. Maybe someone used me. I paused, thinking about the lab, the alarms, the strange gaps in my memory. Either way, that place still exists. The creature's ears lowered slightly. Where they make more. Yeah, I said, where they make more. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Wind moved through the trees along the ridge, carrying the distant scent of rain. Finally, the creature said quietly, "You cannot stop them alone." Probably not, I admitted. Then I looked at it. But I might know how to break their system. The creature tilted its head. I continued, Black projects like that rely on secrecy more than anything else. If the wrong information gets into the open, if the public starts asking questions, the entire program collapses overnight. The creature's golden eyes flickered with something like understanding. Expose the hunt. Exactly. It looked back toward the southern forest, where the hunters were still somewhere out there searching. They will come for you. They already are, I said. The creature stepped closer and held out its hand. For a moment I thought it was offering the metal plate around its neck again, but instead it placed a clawed finger against the tag in my palm. Keep it, it said. I frowned. Why? Proof, the creature replied, of what they hide. I closed my hand around the tag slowly. That made sense. No one would believe a story about hidden laboratories and engineered creatures without something real to back it up. I slipped the tag back into my pocket. The creature turned then and looked toward the northern mountains again. If they build more cages, it said quietly, we will break them. I nodded once. Deal. For a long moment we simply stood there on the ridge, 2 survivors of the same hunt, looking out over the wilderness. Then the creature began walking toward the deeper forest, without another word. Within seconds, the trees swallowed its dark shape completely. I remained on the ridge a little longer, listening to the wind and the distant sounds of the forest. Somewhere far behind me, the hunters were still searching the wrong valley. But eventually they would realize the signal was false. Eventually they would come looking for me again. That was fine, because now I knew where to go next. I turned away from the cliff and started south through the trees, back toward the roads and towns, and the kind of places where secrets like theirs were hardest to hide. And as I walked, one thought stayed clear in my mind. The agency had spent years hunting monsters in the forest. They had never expected one of their former contractors to start hunting them back. The forest grew quiet again behind me as the sun disappeared beyond the mountains. And somewhere deep in that wilderness, a wounded creature continued its journey into the dark, free for the first time in years. Meanwhile, far away in a hidden facility buried under concrete and steel, alarms would soon begin ringing as someone discovered a trail that led straight back to them. And this time, the cage doors wouldn't stay closed.